1/3 of the world's oil moves through a waterway that is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Right now, Iran is threatening to charge tolls, payable in Chinese yuan or cryptocurrency, on every ship that passes through it. The International Energy Agency just called what is happening there the most severe oil supply shock in recorded history. And Washington's response is a pipeline proposal that exists at this moment only in a policy memo. Meanwhile, the so-called alternatives, the Saudi and Emirati pipelines that were supposed to make this crisis manageable, have already been hit by Iranian missiles and drones. So here is the question that no one in the press briefing rooms is asking. What exactly is the backup plan for the backup plan? What you just heard is not a hypothetical. It is the situation on the ground today. The Strait of Hormuz, the single most important choke point in the global energy system, is under active Iranian threat. The U.S. Navy is already deployed there under something called Project Freedom, and the world is waking up to a vulnerability that analysts have known about for decades, but that markets, governments, and ordinary people chose to ignore because the alternative was too difficult and too expensive to think about. This video is going to give you the full picture, not the press release version, not the talking points version. By the end of this, you will know exactly what the ARAM Express pipeline proposal actually is, who is behind it, and whether it can realistically solve the problem it claims to address. You will understand which Gulf states are already partially insulated from a Hormuz shutdown and which ones are completely exposed with no fallback. And you will understand the detail that almost every news outlet covering this story has missed, that the existing alternative routes are already under attack, and the new proposal does not yet answer how it would survive the same threat. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. The story begins with a strip of ocean 21 miles wide and the question of who controls it. The Fox News Digital report published on May 5, 2026, revealed the existence of a U.S.-backed policy memo outlining a proposal called ARAM Express. The memo, reviewed by Fox News Digital, was originated by Richard Goldberg of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a Washington-based think tank with deep ties to U.S. national security circles. The proposal calls for a consortium between the United States and Gulf partner nations to construct a multi-directional overland network of pipelines carrying oil, gas, and petrochemicals. The routes, as envisioned, would extend westward toward the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and southward toward the Arabian Sea. The goal? To create multiple export pathways for Gulf energy that do not pass through the Strait of Hormuz at all. The proposal emerged against an acute backdrop. Since March 2026, the Israel-U.S. conflict with Iran has triggered Iranian missile strikes on Gulf refineries and ports. The U.S. has deployed naval forces to the strait under Project Freedom, a mission described by White House spokeswoman Taylor Rogers as a humanitarian effort to restore freedom of navigation. President Trump has issued direct warnings to Tehran against interfering with shipping lanes. Iran has not backed down. On the contrary, it has threatened to impose a tolling system on ships transiting the strait, demanding payment in Chinese yuan or cryptocurrency. That threat alone represents a fundamental challenge to the dollar-denominated global energy order. The story broke Monday. The geopolitical architecture it exposed has been decades in the making. The Strait of Hormuz has been the pressure point of global energy for as long as the modern oil economy has existed. It is not a river or a canal. It is a natural choke point, the only sea passage between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean. At its narrowest, ships navigate a shipping lane that is barely 2 miles wide in each direction. Through that gap passes roughly 1/3 of the world's seaborne oil. On some metrics, closer to 20% of all oil and natural gas consumed globally. Iran has threatened to close the strait before. In 2011 and 2012, during tensions over its nuclear program, Iranian officials openly warned that they could shut it down within hours. In 2019, tankers were attacked, limpet mines were found attached to hulls, and the U.S. nearly launched airstrikes. Each time, the crisis eased before it became a full closure. Each time, global markets exhaled. And each time, the underlying structural vulnerability that one hostile nation sits on the eastern shore of the world's most critical energy artery remained unaddressed. The reason is simple. The cost of building genuine alternatives is staggering, and the political will to do it only appears when the threat feels real. For decades, it did not feel real enough. Gulf states built some partial alternatives. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu has been operational for years. The UAE built a pipeline to Fujairah, a port outside the strait on the Gulf of Oman. These projects reduced exposure. They did not eliminate it. Since March 2026, the calculus changed. Iranian strikes on Gulf infrastructure, refineries, ports, pipelines, have demonstrated that Tehran is willing to use its military reach in ways that previous Iranian governments kept as threats rather than actions. The April 2026 International Energy Agency report described the resulting disruption as the most severe oil supply shock in recorded history. That phrase, worst in recorded history, landed in financial markets like a depth charge. The world is now having the conversation it should have had 30 years ago. The difference is that this time, ships are being attacked while the conversation is happening. Here is what you need to hold on to from everything you just heard. The alternatives that Saudi Arabia and the UAE spent years building, the infrastructure that policymakers are pointing to right now as proof that Hormuz can be bypassed, those alternatives have already been hit by Iranian missiles and drones. This is not a future risk. It happened. And the new pipeline proposal does not yet explain how it survives the same threat. That question is at the center of everything we are going to examine next. If you are finding this valuable, subscribe now. We are just getting to the most important part. Richard Goldberg is the architect of the ARAM Express concept. A senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Goldberg has spent years focused on Iran's sanctions policy and energy leverage. His stated argument is that this is no longer an abstract long-term idea, that the current crisis has made it operationally urgent. His actual position? The threat to Hormuz will not disappear as long as the Islamic Republic survives in its current form, which means the structural alternative must be built, regardless of whether any one diplomatic episode resolves. Mike Waltz, now serving as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, publicly endorsed the direction during a Monday conference call with reporters. His language was careful but directional. He confirmed Gulf partners are actively thinking through alternative pathways and diversified economic routes. The significance? This is a senior U.S. official signaling that ARAM Express-style thinking has moved from think tank memo to active diplomatic conversation. Saudi Arabia is the critical swing player. Riyadh has spent more than any other Gulf state on Hormuz bypass infrastructure. Its east-west pipeline, stretching from eastern oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, gives it genuine partial independence from the strait. Salman al-Ansari, a Saudi geopolitical analyst, told Fox News Digital that the kingdom is positioned to absorb shocks and keep global flows moving. Saudi Arabia has a strategic incentive to expand that capacity further. The more indispensable its alternative routes become, the more regional leverage it accumulates as Iran weakens. The UAE is aligned with Saudi Arabia on infrastructure diversification, with its Fujairah pipeline representing a second partial bypass. But Fujairah port has already been targeted by Iranian drones. The UAE's position is precarious, caught between the desire for strategic resilience and the reality that its existing alternative infrastructure sits within Iranian strike range. Iran is the threat actor around which everything else organizes. Its strategy is coercive. Make the cost of Hormuz dependence unbearable enough to extract concessions. The proposed tolling system, charging for transit in yuan or crypto, represents a further escalation of that strategy into the financial domain. Kuwait and Qatar are the most exposed. Kuwait has no meaningful alternative export route. Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, is similarly constrained. Their exposure is the reason the ARAM Express proposal matters not just as a grand geopolitical concept, but as an immediate crisis management tool. For the tanker captains navigating the strait right now, the geopolitical debate in Washington is background noise. The immediate reality is threat assessment, insurance premiums that have gone vertical, and routing decisions made hour by hour. Iranian-backed disruption has already hit Fujairah port, a facility the UAE spent years positioning as its Hormuz bypass anchor. That attack was not theoretical. Ships were disrupted. Export flows from the UAE were interrupted. The port that was supposed to be the answer was itself a target. In Kuwait, which Goldberg specifically named as being in a world of hurt, there is no infrastructure to fall back on. Kuwait's oil exports move through the Gulf, through the Strait, and into global markets. If the Strait closes or becomes prohibitively risky, Kuwaiti export revenue collapses. The government's budget is overwhelmingly dependent on that oil revenue. The human consequence is not abstract. It is public services, employment, the basic functioning of the state. In Qatar, the exposure is gas rather than oil, but the vulnerability is comparable. Qatar's liquefied natural gas, fuel for power plants across Europe and Asia, moves through the Gulf of Hormuz. European countries that rushed to secure Qatari LNG contracts after 2022 as a replacement for Russian pipeline gas are now staring at a second energy dependency crisis arriving from a different direction. For ordinary energy consumers across Europe and Asia, the disruption is already being felt in prices. The IEA's characterization of the current shock as the worst in history is not a projection. It is a description of what households and businesses are already experiencing. You now know what the proposal is, who is pushing it, and who is most exposed if it fails or arrives too late. But remember the question that opened this video. We asked whether the pipeline plan can be built fast enough and through stable enough territory to actually neutralize Iran's leverage before the crisis hardens into something permanent. That question does not yet have an answer. And when you hear what comes next about the geopolitical forces that could derail ARAM Express before the first pipe is ever laid, you will understand exactly why that question keeps serious analysts up at night. The most strategically significant response to this story is not coming from Washington. It is coming from Beijing. And what China has not said is more important than anything it has. China is the largest single importer of Gulf oil. It is also Iran's most significant economic partner and diplomatic shield at the United Nations. Those two facts are in direct tension with each other right now. Richard Goldberg said it plainly. Even China cannot tolerate the risk of a sustained disruption to Hormuz. That is almost certainly true on the economics. But China has not publicly pressured Iran to back down, has not condemned the tolling proposal, and has not endorsed ARAM Express or any U.S.-backed alternative route framework. Beijing's silence is itself a strategic posture. It benefits from a world where Gulf energy dependence on a choke point that Iran can threaten gives China leverage over Iran, over the Gulf states, and over Washington. A world where ARAM Express is built and Hormuz becomes strategically irrelevant is a world where one of China's most valuable pressure points disappears. Europe's reaction has been more overt, but not more effective. European buyers have been described in the Fox News reporting as desperate for supply resilience. After the Russian gas shock of 2022, European governments and energy companies understand viscerally what dependency on a single supply route means. They are theoretically natural investors in the ARAM Express framework. The political question is whether European governments, many of which are still navigating domestic energy politics and fiscal constraints, can mobilize capital at the speed the crisis demands. Asian importers, particularly Japan and South Korea, are watching with alarm. South Korea is already investigating a vessel attack in the region. Japan, almost entirely dependent on imported energy, faces catastrophic exposure if Hormuz disruption becomes sustained. The UN, through Ambassador Waltz, is pursuing a resolution to stop Iranian mining of the shipping route. That effort reflects the limits of the immediate response. Even the world's most powerful military is managing a crisis rather than resolving the underlying structural problem. ARAM Express is the attempt to resolve the structure. The world is not yet certain it will arrive in time. Here is the implication of this story that almost no headline is examining, and it changes the way you should understand everything the U.S. and its Gulf partners are saying publicly. The existing bypass infrastructure, Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline to Yanbu, the UAE's Fujairah pipeline, is not safe. Iranian missiles struck the Abqaiq-Yanbu pipeline corridor. Iranian drones hit Fujairah port. These are not warnings, they are demonstrations. Iran has already proven that it can reach and degrade the infrastructure that the current response strategy depends on. The RSIS analysis from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, published weeks ago, made this explicit. The existing alternative routes are known Iranian targets. Building ARAM Express addresses the geography of Hormuz dependence. It does not, by itself, address the security threat that makes that dependence dangerous. A new pipeline running through Saudi Arabia or the UAE passes through the same airspace and missile range as the pipelines and ports that have already been hit.
This is the implication that the policy memo, as reported, does not yet resolve. ARAM Express would require not just construction financing and international participation, it would require a security architecture capable of defending multi-thousand-kilometer pipeline infrastructure against Iranian air and missile attack. That is an extraordinarily different and more expensive proposition than building the pipeline itself. The political framing of ARAM Express as an infrastructure project obscures this. Infrastructure can be funded by European and Asian buyers seeking supply resilience. Pipeline security against a state adversary with ballistic missiles requires military commitments that no commercial consortium can provide. When Goldberg says this is not just a long-term idea anymore, he is correct that the urgency is real. What remains unstated is that the urgency of the security problem is equal to or greater than the urgency of the infrastructure problem. You cannot pour concrete faster than Iran can fire a missile. The most important question this proposal has not yet answered is who defends the pipe. You now know something that most of the coverage of this story is missing entirely: the geography problem. Hormuz as a choke point has a geographic solution. The ARAM Express pipeline network addresses that. But the security problem, that Iran can strike the alternative infrastructure, does not have a solution in the current proposal. And that gap is not a policy detail. It is the difference between a plan that works and a plan that looks like it works until the first missile lands. What happens next? The scenarios that analysts are gaming out right now becomes much darker when you factor in that distinction. If ARAM Express is built, financed by European and Asian buyers, secured by a credible military architecture, and operational within a realistic time frame, the geopolitical consequence is profound. Iran loses its most powerful non-nuclear lever over the global economy. The threat to close Hormuz, a threat Tehran has wielded for decades, becomes empty. A regime whose primary economic coercion tool is neutralized faces a strategic landscape that looks considerably worse for its survival. That is the geopolitical stake for Tehran, and it explains why any serious effort to build ARAM Express will face Iranian counterpressure from the moment it becomes credible. Economically, the stakes operate on two timelines. In the immediate term, measured in weeks and months, every day the strait remains disrupted or under threat adds to what the IEA has already called the worst oil supply shock in history. European households and Asian industries are absorbing costs right now. Kuwait and Qatar face the slow-motion erosion of export revenue. The longer this persists, the deeper the economic damage and the harder the recovery. On the longer timeline, measured in years, the stakes involve the reorganization of global energy architecture. Countries with alternative route infrastructure gain leverage.
Countries without it lose it. Saudi Arabia, if ARAM Express becomes real and Riyadh is its anchor, consolidates a position as the indispensable energy logistics hub for the post-Hormuz era. That is not just an energy story, it is a story about which nations hold structural power in the next decade of global politics. The military stakes are the most acute right now. Iran has demonstrated willingness to strike Gulf infrastructure. If the U.S. naval presence under Project Freedom is sustained, the risk of direct military confrontation between U.S. forces and Iranian assets escalates with every passing week. The triggering threshold is not abstract. It is a U.S. vessel or allied vessel taking significant damage from an Iranian attack. At that point, the political calculus in Washington shifts from containment to response. The worst case is not a closed strait. The worst case is a closed strait, a failed or delayed ARAM Express, sustained Iranian strikes on Gulf infrastructure, and a military exchange that draws regional actors in directions that no one currently controls. The energy shock becomes a security shock, becomes a global recession. That sequence is not inevitable, but every element of it is currently in motion. Richard Goldberg's core analytical argument from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is that the Hormuz threat is regime persistent, meaning it will not go away through diplomacy as long as the Islamic Republic exists in its current form. His prescription follows directly. The structural alternative must be built not as a crisis response, but as a permanent re-architecting of global energy logistics. That is a hawkish but coherent analytical framework, and it is the intellectual spine of the ARAM Express proposal. Salman al-Ansari, the Saudi geopolitical analyst quoted in the Fox News reporting, offered a notably confident assessment of Riyadh's positioning. His claim that Saudi Arabia is uniquely positioned to absorb shocks and keep global flows moving reflects Riyadh's own strategic interest in being seen as indispensable. But it is also grounded in the fact that the East-West pipeline does provide genuine partial bypass capacity. The qualifier matters. Partial, not complete. Yonatan Adiri, the Israeli entrepreneur and former advisor to President Shimon Peres, offered the most structurally significant analysis in the reporting. He argued that the entire arrangement, the long-standing Gulf energy architecture centered on Hormuz, is starting to expire. That is not a crisis analysis. That is a structural historical claim that the geopolitical and economic forces now in motion are fragmenting the Gulf energy system in ways that will persist regardless of how the immediate conflict resolves. The RSIS analysis from Singapore provides the most rigorous external check on the optimism in the U.S.-backed proposal. The Singapore researchers note explicitly that the existing alternative routes are known Iranian targets, that none of the current alternatives can replace the volume that flows through Hormuz, and that the security architecture required to protect overland alternatives represents an entirely different order of commitment than infrastructure construction. The International Energy Agency's April 2026 characterization of the current disruption as the worst oil supply shock in history provides the economic baseline. This is not a think tank framing exercise. It is the institutional assessment of the world's foremost energy monitoring body. Taken together, the expert picture is this. The proposal is serious. The urgency is real. The partial alternatives exist but are already under attack. And the full solution, an overland pipeline network that is genuinely secure, requires military and political commitments that have not yet been made. We opened this video with a question. We asked whether ARAM Express can be built fast enough and through stable enough territory to actually neutralize Iran's leverage before the crisis becomes permanent. Here is what we now know. The geographic solution exists on paper. The partial alternatives exist on the ground. They have already been attacked. The security architecture required to protect the new proposal does not yet exist. And the single actor most capable of derailing the entire plan, Iran, has already demonstrated both the will and the capability to do exactly that. The most consequential question this story leaves open is the one we are about to address directly. Best case, Iran's position weakens further under sustained military and economic pressure. A ceasefire or political transition creates enough stability for Gulf states and U.S. partners to begin genuine construction of ARAM Express infrastructure, and European and Asian buyers commit long-term supply contracts that fund the project. Saudi Arabia's existing east-west capacity is expanded significantly as a bridge measure. The IEA's worst-ever oil shock becomes a turning point rather than a new permanent baseline. This outcome requires both a meaningful reduction in Iranian threat capacity and a sustained international political commitment that has not yet materialized. It is possible. It is not likely on the current trajectory. Likely case. The immediate crisis stabilizes enough to ease the worst of the oil supply shock, but does not resolve the underlying structural problem. ARAM Express advances as a diplomatic conversation and a planning document, not as a construction project. The existing partial alternatives, Saudi Yanbu, UAE Fujairah, are patched and partially restored after Iranian strikes, but remain vulnerable. Gulf states continue incremental infrastructure expansion. Kuwait and Qatar remain significantly exposed. The tolling threat from Iran creates a sustained period of elevated shipping risk and insurance costs. The global economy absorbs a painful but not catastrophic adjustment. The Hormuz choke point remains the world's most dangerous single-point energy vulnerability for the foreseeable future, and the conversation about ARAM Express becomes a feature of every future Iran crisis. The proposal exists. The pipeline does not. Worst case, Iranian strikes on Gulf infrastructure intensify rather than abate. The Fujairah and Yanbu alternatives are degraded to the point of operational failure. A direct military exchange between U.S. forces and Iran triggers an escalation spiral that draws in regional actors. The tolling regime on Hormuz becomes partially operational, fragmenting the global dollar-denominated energy order. Kuwait faces a genuine fiscal crisis. Qatar LNG deliveries to Europe are disrupted, triggering a second European energy emergency. Oil prices reach levels that generate recession conditions across multiple major economies. In this scenario, ARAM Express is no longer a proposal. It is the desperate post-crisis reconstruction plan for a system that has already broken. Something about this story demands more than a summary, so let me ask you two things directly, and I genuinely want to know what you think. The first question is this: if ARAM Express requires a military security architecture to protect it from Iranian attack, and that architecture does not exist yet, is it really a pipeline proposal, or is it a military commitment disguised as an infrastructure project? Because those are very different things, with very different price tags and very different political consequences. And the second question: we have known about the Hormuz vulnerability for decades. Oil shocks in the 1970s, Iranian threats in 2011, tanker attacks in 2019.
At what point does the failure to build genuine alternatives stop being a policy oversight and start being a choice? And who has benefited from that choice? Drop your answers in the comments. This is the kind of question where the most interesting answer is probably the one I have not thought of. Here are the 3 things you need to carry out of this video. First, the ARAM Express proposal is real, it is serious, and it has reached the level of U.S. diplomatic signaling through Ambassador Waltz, but it exists as a memo, not a construction plan. The gap between those two things is enormous, and nothing in the current public record suggests that gap is close to being closed. Second, the existing partial alternatives, Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline and the UAE's Fujairah pipeline, are not safe. Iranian missiles and drones have already hit both.
The security architecture required to protect new overland infrastructure against the same threat has not been proposed, funded, or politically committed to by any actor. This is the most under-examined dimension of the entire story. Third, the countries most exposed, Kuwait with no meaningful alternative, Qatar with its LNG locked in the strait, are not the countries with the loudest voices in the current policy debate. Their vulnerability is the clearest measure of how urgent this problem actually is and how far the current proposals are from solving it. In the coming days, watch for two specific developments. Watch whether the UN resolution that Ambassador Waltz is pursuing against Iranian mining of the shipping route gains meaningful support, or whether it stalls, which would tell you exactly where China and Russia stand. And watch whether any Gulf state makes a concrete financial commitment to ARAM Express infrastructure, because that commitment, if it comes, is the signal that the proposal has moved from diplomacy to reality. This story is not over.
What happens in the next 72 hours on the diplomatic front at the UN and in the next several weeks on the ground in the Gulf could determine whether ARAM Express becomes a generational infrastructure project or the plan the world was too slow to build. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. The world has known for decades that 21 miles of water could bring the global economy to its knees. The question was never whether it would happen. The question was always whether we would build the alternative before it did.